In the years following the end of World War II, two nations spurred on by the economic and industrial growth that had occurred in the wake of the greatest conflict of the 20th century would rise to unprecedented, never-before-seen power. These two nations, titans of the ages, once allies during the war, had now grown paranoid of one another, and as one nation leaped on over the other in the interminable conquest of military might and technological excellence, a Cold War would emerge as tensions between the two superpowers would rise, with fear and paranoia gripping either side. First, it was the atomic bomb, more terrifying than any other weapon before it. Then, it was speed. Faster, higher, farther, until one technological breakthrough changed everything. The first satellite launched into orbit around the Earth would forever change the tide of the conflict. This new technological breakthrough, though primarily a military weapon tasked with the delivery of nuclear weapons at supersonic speeds and across entire continents, would see a redeeming quality bestowed upon it, as space would now be seen as the next frontier. To some, it was a battleground where the struggles of the future between the nations of the future would be fought. To others, military conquest served only as the excuse for the pursuit of a greater, loftier goal. And so it was that the United States and the Soviet Union would begin their respective pursuits to establish themselves as the frontrunners and leaders of this new frontier. But one nation to the east, the Middle Kingdom, forgotten by the West, overlooked due to the dread of possible nuclear war, was itself quietly undergoing a massive transformation from within. Under the leadership of a visionary, imbued by visions of greatness for the future, stirred by the might of the emperors and kingdoms of generations past, one man would rise to become the hero of a hitherto sleeping giant that would not remain dormant for long. This man would come to be the head of the Red Dragon. Born to a peasant family in Hunan, a revolutionary and political theorist, the one who founded the People's Republic of China and who would lead the country until his death, Mao Zedong would become the leader of the Chinese Communist Party during what became known as the Long March, and a man whose dreams of glory he could not contain nor keep to himself. Together, Mao and Stalin safeguarded the national interests of both China and the Soviet Union with what was known as the Treaty of Friendship, Alliance, and Mutual Assistance. The treaty improved the two countries' geopolitical relationship on the political, military, and economic fronts. Despite the favorable terms, the USSR did not directly control Mao's government. In a few years, the differences between the Soviet and Chinese interpretations and applications of communism would void the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship. Stalin's generosity to Mao during the more favorable times between the two nations was often expressed via military aid. Fighter aircraft like the Mikhail Gurevich 15 were manufactured in the Soviet Union and flown to China by Soviet pilots, where, there, Chinese pilots from the People's Liberation Army Air Force would learn how to fly and operate the new machines. But now that the once allied nations in a common communist cause began to be at odds with one another, the Sino-Soviet conflict saw the gradual worsening of relations between the People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union. Additionally, against those ideological differences, Mao also took a belligerent stance towards capitalist Western world and publicly rejected the Soviet Union's policy of peaceful coexistence between the Western and Eastern blocs. Beijing also resented the Soviet Union's growing ties with other nations surrounding China. Ever the revolutionary and dreamer, Mao, not unaware of the technological triumphs that had seen both the United States and the USSR reach beyond the earthly realm, even to the moon, had visions of greatness himself, where China could and should soar among the stars. For, he said, why should Marxist revisionists and corrupt capitalists be left alone to roam the heavens? As far as he was concerned, the stars belonged to China and its pure socialist nation. The vast expanse of the cosmos, if the stars were to be believed, was the dwelling place of the Red Dragon. But with the now unbridgeable divide following the Sino-Soviet split, Mao no longer had access to the Soviets' war machines. Though the rising tensions between the two communist nations had led to an eventual split, In his cunning and foresight, Mao had paved the way to help ensure for some of those key technological and military items of interest to find their way into a growing Chinese arsenal. If his dreams and visions of cosmic Chinese grandeur were going to become a reality, China had to catch up technologically, and it had to do so quickly. China had to itself become a nation of industry, manufacturing, science, and technology. And what better way to do so than to let oneself be inspired by another's work? And so began what would become one of the staples of Chinese industrial development: technological deconstruction and reconstructive analysis. What's up everybody, you've been watching For All Kerbalkind, China Episode 1, China Rising. It was a really long time coming, as during the wait many important things happened behind the scenes, including Beardy bringing about some massive updates and changes to the For All Kerbalkind mod pack, not least of which was adding all of the Chinese parts and check tree changes for yours truly. Hopefully, it was all worth the wait. Bit of a different episode this time around, as I really wanted to set the scene for China entering the fold, but the following episodes should be much more game-centric. Of course, as I prepare the next episode in the China series, Carnassa, Beardy, and N9 will be hard at work on their follow-up episodes, so stay tuned for that. In the meantime, feel free to check out the Discord if you want to stay up to date on the latest fact news, and the Patreon is there if you would like to show your support in a special way. But until then, I have been Calvin McClure, and this is For All Kerbalkind.